Great, so let's look together at the heart of the great encyclical Evangelium Vitae. This was published on the 25th of March 1995 after 4 years of consultation with the bishops throughout the world. It's a massive document, nearly 50,000 words. If you haven't read it, all I can say as people in healthcare is please do. It is still the fundamental point of reference for us as Catholics in healthcare. And I'm just going to do two things. I'm going to present a brief overview of the encyclical, picking out some of the highlights from each chapter. And secondly, I'm going to point out some aspects of the text that just strike me as particularly interesting and worthy of discussion. So, first of all, just hopping through the encyclical, many of you, well look, let's do this. How many of you have read some of this encyclical? Put your hands up, don't be shy. Yeah, a third of you maybe. So that's great. So let's open it up for those who haven't heard it before. Chapter 1, Present Day Threats to Human Life. It casts an eye over the contemporary situation. Pope John Paul sees a clash taking place between, famously, a culture of life and a culture of death, with particular threats to human life including abortion, embryo research and euthanasia. He notes that prenatal diagnosis often leads to abortion that is consciously eugenic in intent, quote, which accepts life only under certain conditions and rejects it when it is affected by any limitation, handicap or illness. How much more this is an issue today, and many other issues as we speak. Pope John Paul points out the surprising contradiction within discussions of human rights today. So he's stepping back from medicine. Quote, precisely in an age when the inviolable rights of the person are solemnly proclaimed and the value of life is publicly affirmed, the very right to life is being denied or trampled upon. It reminds us of the tragedy that has overtaken Amnesty International in the last few years, where an organisation dedicated to the defence of human rights and human life now advocates for abortion, and so denies the most fundamental right to life on which all other rights are based. Pope John Paul understands the cultural ambiguities here that pave the way for such baffling contradictions, and writes that attacks against the unborn and the needy and the elderly, quote, go directly against respect for life, and they represent a direct threat to the entire culture of human rights. Do you see what he's doing? He's not attacking that culture. He's saying, let's honour it truly and not undermine it from within. So the encyclical is not, in this respect, a complaint. The Pope expresses a deep sympathy with the sufferings that lead people to misguided decisions. He understands the individual situations, the social pressures, the anxieties, the sufferings involved. The central affirmation, though, in Chapter 1 is of the sacred value of human life from its beginning until its end, and because of that, the importance of universal human rights. Chapter 2, the Christian message concerning life. This describes the goodness of human life, which comes from God as a gift, and is destined for an eternal communion with Him. This goodness is revealed more and more clearly through the Old Testament. In the negative commandment, you shall not kill, and then in the positive commandment, to love your neighbour as yourself. And the revelation is fulfilled in Jesus Christ as He freely takes on human life in the Incarnation, and as he gives His life as a total gift for others on the cross. Love of neighbour is extended and fulfilled in the stranger, and ultimately in love of one's enemy. Quote, Thus, the deepest element of God's commandment to protect human life is the requirement to show reverence and love for every person and for the life of every person. Chapter 3. God's Holy Law. Here Pope John Paul presents the doctrinal core of Evangelium Vitae. There are small but significant sections on the meaning of legitimate self-defence and the shrinking circumstances in which capital punishment might be morally acceptable as a last resort. But the chapter circles around 3 doctrinal pronouncements concerning innocent life, abortion and euthanasia. These are not new teachings, but they are confirmations and clarifications of the Church's constant teaching about the value of human life, and they become solidified and enshrined in this encyclical for us today. The first pronouncement, the first teaching, I quote, "The direct and voluntary killing of an innocent human being is always gravely immoral." Human life. Second, quote, "Direct abortion, that is, abortion willed as an end or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being." It's simply applying the teaching in the first principle to the difficult cases of the unborn child. And third, euthanasia is defined as, quote, "an action or omission which of itself and by intention causes death, with the purpose of eliminating all suffering." And this is, quote, "a grave violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person." And this third chapter finishes with an examination of the relationship between civil law and moral law. Civil law will not necessarily mirror the moral law, since they have 2 different functions. But the purpose of civil law is to ensure, quote, "the common good of people through the recognition and defence of their fundamental rights and the promotion of peace and of public morality. Therefore," my words now, "the civil law may not undermine fundamental human rights, such as the right to life, since these innate rights form the basis of that common good which is the very goal of the civil law. And if it does undermine those rights, the civil law contradicts and destroys itself." Chapter 4. For a new culture of human life. And here Pope John Paul emphasises how it's not enough just to proclaim moral truth, and how relevant this is for yourselves, but that cultures must be transformed by a witness to the value of life given by individuals and by the Church as a community. There are many different ways we can do this, and a special paragraph is written for those involved in the medical professions, and it's worth quoting this in full. This is paragraph 89.2. Let me quote this. "A unique responsibility belongs to healthcare personnel, doctors, pharmacists, nurses, chaplains, men and women religious, administrators and volunteers. Their profession calls for them to be guardians and servants of human life. In today's social and cultural context, in which science and the practice of medicine risk losing sight of their inherent ethical dimension, healthcare professionals can be strongly tempted at times to become manipulators of life, or even agents of death. In the face of this temptation, their responsibility today is greatly increased. Its deepest inspiration and strongest support lie in the intrinsic and undeniable ethical dimension of the healthcare profession, something already recognised by the ancient and still relevant Hippocratic Oath, which requires every doctor to commit himself to absolute respect for human life and its sacredness. End of quotation. You can look it up, and it's all in my handout. Okay, so that was very quick, yeah? Just some highlights, some key quotations, all of that in 9 minutes. So I hope it sends you back to the encyclical and helps you see how important it is, and that in fact none of this is new. This is not new teaching. It's Pope John Paul II bringing together the biblical Catholic understanding of the meaning of human life and for yourselves of the healthcare profession. And all I'm going to do now, slightly randomly, is to pick out some points for reflection and discussion. And these are just things that have struck me as being of particular interest as I've read the encyclical. First point, what a gift the encyclical is. It brings together the riches of Catholic teaching and tradition and gives clarity about what we believe and where we stand on these key moral issues. Some of these questions have changed slightly in 20 years. There are accelerating developments in embryology and other bioethical fields. There are new technical questions, and there are more pressing questions about the relationship between civil and moral law. But the moral principles we keep coming back to are those outlined in Evangelium Vitae. The dignity of every human life, the absolute prohibition on the deliberate taking of innocent human life, whether it at its very beginnings or right at its end. The necessity that the civil law, at the very least, protects the life of the innocent. These are some of the big themes. We certainly don't, as Catholics, pretend to have the answers to all of society's moral questions. But we do have the fundamental principles which make it possible to construct some answers on sure foundations. That's what we should have the confidence to believe, and you as young professionals in healthcare. The second interesting point is the very phrase, the gospel of life. Maybe we take this term for granted as Catholics now. It's part of our Catholic vocabulary. But it is a bold term to use. We might normally think that life is one of many moral issues. Human life might be a single chapter in a moral theology textbook alongside other important truths, sexual ethics, politics, war, etc. But John Paul goes much further and says that the question of the value of human life is not just one of many moral issues. It's not even just a moral issue, it's the meaning of the very gospel itself. Now this is challenging. He's saying that to go against life is to go against the gospel itself, which is the good news that the Son of God came to share our human life and to give that life its deepest possible significance. Abortion and euthanasia, for example, are not just random items in the index of a moral theology textbook. They are defining issues, since there can be no morality without a foundational belief in the innate value of human life. Do you see the link? And further, there can be no Christian gospel without an appreciation of the dignity of Jesus' own human nature. If you say that life is disposable, what do we understand about salvation, about every life, about Jesus' life? It's all undermined. These are quite radical theological thoughts, but they turn what could be a bland slogan into quite a profound theological challenge for reflection. The third interesting point life has meaning as well as value. Life has meaning as well as value. What does he mean? Well, it's easy to assert that human life has value and dignity, and to give theological reasons for this. Human life is a gift from God, we're created in his image and likeness, etc., etc. Pope John Paul recognises this, but he says it's not enough. It's one thing to assert that life has a value. It's another thing to be able to show that life has a meaning, especially when a life seems to have been wasted or damaged or destroyed. Pope John Paul is writing as a pastoral theologian, and much of his effort is spent trying to propose a meaning to human life, even in suffering. He sees that many people give up on life, not because of some doctrinal rejection about the idea of the value of life, but because they see nowhere else to go. They've lost their purpose. The temptation for them is to resolve the problem of suffering by, quote, eliminating it at root. If suffering is seen just as an evil, then a life filled with suffering becomes a life with no meaning. The job of the Pope, of every priest, parent and teacher, and your job as healthcare professionals is not just to be professional. It's not just to hold on to solid Catholic doctrine. It's to help people make deeper sense of their lives in these difficult circumstances. You're called to be pastoral, in other words, shepherds. You're called, as much as Pope John Paul or me as a priest, to give a new and deeper sense of hope and meaning to people's lives, and to show by your love and example that there is another way, as well as helping them and teaching them. Do you see how important and rich that is? The fourth point, the fourth interesting point, we are dependent persons. We are dependent persons. And I love this as a philosopher who used to teach anthropology. Because John Paul II, as a philosopher, is interested in the human person. He notes that in the modern period there's a mentality which, quote, carries the concept of subjectivity to an extreme and even distorts it, and recognises as a subject of rights only the person who enjoys full, or at least incipient, autonomy, and who emerges from a state of total dependence on others. Bit of a long sentence. What he's saying is, in our modern culture, we're tempted to define a human person as someone who is independent. Yeah? And if you're somehow dependent, you're less of a person. Well, where's that idea come from? In our culture, there is an affirmation of human rights, but at the same time, says John Paul II, there is a tendency, quote, to equate personal dignity with the capacity for verbal and explicit, or at least perceptible, communication. If I can be myself, if I can be free, if I can share my wishes with you, I'm a person. If I can express myself, I'm a person. If I can't, I'm not, or I'm not fully. And John Paul II continues, it is clear that on the basis of these presuppositions, personhood as independence, there's no place in the world for anyone, like the unborn or the dying, who is a weak element in the social structure, or for anyone who appears completely at the mercy of others and radically dependent on them, and can only communicate through the silent language of a profound sharing of affection. He continues, in this case, it is force which becomes the criterion for choice and action in interpersonal relations and in social life. There's a profound view of the human person here. John Paul II is saying, and these are some of the most beautiful passages in the encyclical for me, that to be a person, to be human, is as much about being able to receive as it is being able to give. It is as much about being weak and vulnerable as it is using your strengths and your gifts. Do you see how profound that is? I'm not defined only by my ability to communicate or express myself verbally. And my personal relationships with others and with God are based as much on the language of love, affection and acceptance as on a language expressed with words. This is something we feel instinctively, I think, when we see the smile of a healthy baby. But it's something we should also know through faith and through a sound philosophy whenever we're confronted by human weakness and vulnerability. This is not a lesser person because they are more needy. These truths about the human person are lived out, especially in places like Lourdes and in the L'Arche communities throughout the world, where people with learning disabilities and their assistants live and work together. It is this living interdependence that makes us persons, that is part of our personhood, and not our independence or our autonomy. The fifth interesting point: relationships as well as rights. Relationships as well as rights. As we've seen, Pope John Paul is happy to use the language of human rights and speaks about, quote, the inviolable right to life of every innocent human being. Full stop. But something more is going on. The problem with the language of rights is that we are forced to conceive of human beings as isolated individuals, each possessing his or her individual rights. On these terms, I must never kill my unborn child or my aging parents because they have a right to life. It's true. And that right, so some arguments go, trumps my own desire to end their life for whatever good or bad motives I might harbour. You see, it's all about discussing and fighting about contested, conflicting rights. And there's lots of truth and importance in this. But there is a much simpler and fundamental reason why I shouldn't kill my unborn child or my aging parents, and that's simply because this is my unborn child, these are my aging parents. It's not first of all the rights of an individual, it's the relationships between persons that should be the foundation of our respect for human life. Put another way, it's my responsibility for another that should guide my thoughts and actions, not just my recognition of another's independent rights over against mine. There's a whole philosophy of solidarity here. Remember that word, which engages Pope John Paul throughout his life. We're defined by our relationships with others. To deny their rights is therefore to undermine my own identity, since I am, in my very nature, their brother or sister or cousin or neighbour or son or grandson. The anthropology here is one of being in relationship. And in certain paragraphs of the encyclical, John Paul quite consciously draws on his well-known theology of the body to flesh out his thinking in this area. The tragedy of contemporary attacks on life is that they undermine the very being of the one who carries them out. Now this is subtle and again quite challenging. John Paul II quotes Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, which gives a long list of crimes against life: murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, etc. and then concludes, this is the Second Vatican Council, then concludes that these crimes, quote, do more harm to those who practice them than to those who suffer from the injury. Now this is very provocative, and you might say it's a distasteful statement, to suggest that the murderer or the doctor carrying out the abortion suffers more than the victim or the unborn child. Now it's dangerous, this, but do you see the point? It reflects a view of the human person in which the willful destruction of the other and of the human relationship that's involved here is an evil more damaging and harder to overcome even than the loss of human life. Now you can argue, you can disagree, but the core point is unarguable, is incontrovertible, I think, that we do grave harm to ourselves when we hurt the other, because of hurting the other and because of what it's doing to ourselves and in this relationship. The sixth point: to lose sight of the Creator is to lose sight of the creature. Pope John Paul writes, quote, "When the sense of God is lost, the sense of man is also threatened and poisoned. As the Second Vatican Council says, without the Creator, the creature would disappear. When God is forgotten, the creature itself grows unintelligible. If our transcendent character is forgotten, and we see ourselves solely within the horizon of our physical natures, then, quote, life itself becomes a mere thing which man claims as his exclusive property, completely subject to his control and manipulation." Now be cautious of how you understand this. Pope John Paul is not saying you have to have a Judeo-Christian view of creation in order to appreciate the value of human life. It helps, but that's not his point. He's saying that there is a transcendent dimension to human life, a sense that we are more than just products of chance, that we have a purpose, a destiny, a sense that we are known and loved by a spiritual power far greater than us, and that without these truths it's very hard not to become materialist in our philosophy and then reductive about human nature. And it's hard to keep alive one's moral conscience, since the implicit foundation of both our conscience and our understanding of human dignity is the fact that we believe in a relationship with something, someone, higher than ourselves, and that human life is not just an accident, but a mysterious and precious gift. He's not saying you can't value life if you don't believe in God. But he's saying when you reduce man, woman, the human person, to just a thing, when you have no other reference than materialism, when you lose the sense of the transcendent, then it's very hard to get back an exalted sense of human dignity. The last interesting point, the seventh: challenging questions about democracy. Pope John Paul believes that democracy sometimes can be a form of tyranny. Quote, "When a parliamentary or social majority decrees that it is legal, at least under certain conditions, to kill unborn human life, is it not really making a tyrannical decision with regard to the weakest and most defenceless of human beings?" Another quote: "If, as a result of a tragic obscuring of the collective conscience, an attitude of scepticism were to succeed in bringing into question even the fundamental principles of the moral law, the democratic system itself would be shaken in its foundations and would be reduced to a mere mechanism for regulating different and opposing interests on a purely empirical basis. That's from the encyclical, but looking back to the encyclical Veritatis Splendor about the moral life. Is he exaggerating here? Is he being alarmist? Well, it's clear from the following paragraph that he's not calling for a repudiation of our democracy, of the democracies in which many of us live, but for their renewal and reform. And I quote, "It is therefore urgently necessary for the future of society and the development of a sound democracy to rediscover those essential and innate human and moral values which flow from the very truth of the human being and express and safeguard the dignity of the person. Values which no individual, no majority and no state can ever create, modify or destroy, but must only acknowledge, respect and promote." End of quotation. So Catholic critics do not need to become outlaws or exiles from a flawed democratic society. We need to be committed to the process and renew it from within. And if the democratic law continues to legitimise grave crimes, quote, "there is no obligation in conscience to obey such laws. Instead, there is a grave and clear obligation to oppose them by conscientious objection." Paragraph 73(1). So in this way, there's a bit of tension here, of course. But John Paul is saying we are able, hopefully, to live and pray and work within a flawed political system, and for yourselves, within a flawed healthcare system, without having to just blindly accept and go along with the worst consequences of the political will. We can be committed citizens, hopefully without having to compromise our moral convictions. And this refusal to compromise is in fact a commitment to the foundations of democratic society. This is John Paul II's most significant political argument. Do you see how important it is? When you get accused of standing out and taking a stand for its own sake, or just because you're stubborn, or just because you're in a Catholic bubble, or just because you want to make trouble, whatever the accusation, your answer is, no, the reason I'm standing up for my conscience, for what I believe to be true, is because I believe in democracy. It's because I'm fighting for the very values that underpin our democracy and the very values that underpin our healthcare systems. You're not being the awkward customer as healthcare professionals. You're being the professionals who believe in healthcare and for that reason feel the need sometimes to stand up and speak out. The pro-life Christian protester is actually standing up for democratic values and for the values, the true values, the authentic values, in your case, of the healthcare system. Pope John Paul wants us to be realistic about the evils that can come about through democracy, but at the same time hopeful about the possibility of renewing and reforming that democracy. My conclusion. The issues that prompted John Paul II to write Evangelium Vitae have not gone away. Indeed, they've intensified. It is a profound document that brings together and clarifies the moral convictions of the Catholic tradition regarding the dignity of human life and connects them with a philosophy of the human person that should appeal to all those who are genuinely interested in the mystery of human life. It contains much sound advice about how we can help each other to appreciate the value of human life, even in difficulty and suffering. And it contains some prophetic warnings about what can go wrong in the human heart and in the political system when the value of human life is undermined. I hope that many of you will have the chance not just to reflect on these thoughts, but to actually read this marvellous document yourselves. Thank you very much.